It is time for another edition of the Fight HQ podcast. Of course, I am Jason Floyd, rolling solo once again here on Fight HQ. Of course, if you've been following Pete on social media, you know why Pete is not here. Pete will be back next week as we get you ready for next week's UFC pay-per-view. Of course, as always, appreciate everyone that tunes in to every episode of Fight HQ. Of course, we're going to be talking about UFC Perth, which goes down tomorrow night here in the United States, 7 p.m. lock time for the prelims, main card, 10 p.m. Eastern time. Of course, the entire event will be on ESPN Plus. Of course, this fight card taking place over in Perth, Western Australia, which means locally it is a Sunday morning card, 7 a.m. first fights there. That's why the weigh-ins have not taken place yet. The weigh-ins are tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern time, and I will tell you there is one fight on the card that I'm really particular to see what do the weigh-ins look like, and that is the female matchup between Montague and Carolina. Carolina moving up to 135 pounds after the weigh-in issues at 125 pounds. Montague, of course, she comes in from the PFL where she competed at 145 pounds, so she's going down to 135 pounds. So that is one that definitely is paying attention. Of course, we did lose a fight yesterday. 𝗲𝗲𝘁𝐿IOTT being pulled from the fight card due to an illness, so his matchup is no longer on this fight card. Of course, when you look at this fight card, primarily, this is an Australia UFC fight night card here, but you do have a key matchup in the main event of Carlos Ulberg and Dominic Reyes. I mean, you can pretty much say likely number one contender matchup in the light heavyweight division, with the winner likely to get the winner of next week's light heavyweight title fight. So if you got any questions about UFC Perth, you can hit that right now, whether that's all here on YouTube or in the Discord chat as well. I know there's already been some questions in our Discord. I'll get to those as the show does go on, but talking about game theory, and when I first started looking at this fight card and breaking it down, the first thing that really stuck out to me, even before I saw what the DraftKings lines on this were from a DFS perspective, was the wide margin in the main event of Carlos Ulberg being a 2.5 to 1 betting favorite, which should he be the favorite of the matchup? Yes, I think he should be the favorite of the matchup. Should he be a minus 250 betting favorite and priced at 9,300 on DK, and Dom Reyes being priced at 6,900? No, I don't think so. And so that was this morning. One of the things that I was doing as I was getting ready for this show was looking at what are the ownership aspects, and I truly thought Dom Reyes' ownership would be a little higher than what it is. So that one definitely surprised me, because as I look at my sheet right now and looking at some underdogs I'm going to be looking at, Dom Reyes probably will be my most popular underdog that I'm going to have in my lineups tomorrow, just because of I think the fight is much closer. I know one of the questions we always get is where's the value on this card? To me, the value starts right at the main event. Maybe and then I thought maybe Ulberg would have a little less ownership than what he's currently projected at. So, to me, when I look at 9,000 range, I'll tell you this right now, there's some fighters at 9,000 range I don't trust, and really concerning whether they can go out there and get us 100 points when we're talking about the DraftKings scoring system. But to me, this is a week where it doesn't happen often, but there's a lot of underdogs I'm targeting this week. As I look at my sheet, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 7 underdogs I will be targeting when we're talking about developing our DFS lineups. One of those is going to be Dom Reyes. There is, one of the underdogs I'll say that I'll likely be targeting. It's one that I don't feel good in. And there's a couple of fights where I don't feel good in picking either side, and that's the matchup between Justin Tafa and Louis Sutherland. It's going to be a boom-bust play, but Sutherland is one of those underdogs that I do have target of going after. There are some, guys in that 7K range I really find interesting. I find Charlie Campbell very interesting at 7,600. Bellato, 7,100. Roston at 7,700 I find interesting. Colby Thickness at 7,500 is one that sticks out to me. Then there's some fighters that I'll just say this, I think they're on my do not trust list. The co-main event is one of them. Jimmy Crute likely goes out there and gets a victory. Don't have a ton of trust in Jimmy Crute out there as well. Do I really want to get to a 9,400 Jack Jenkins? I think he wins the fight, and I think leg kicks are going to be the key to that victory. But does he pay off that price tag? So that's kind of the concerning thing I have with there. Then I start looking at who could potentially be our takedown city artist. Main event, I expect is going to be on the feet. I don't expect that's going to be a matchup that goes to the ground. But I look at someone like a 𝗲𝗁 being able to take on Carolina. I think that, she probably gets a stoppage victory at some point, maybe probably in the second round, but she is someone that I would target in terms of the takedown abilities. Jamie Mullarkey at 8,000 is a fighter that I would target when we're talking about takedown abilities. You got to look at Rodolfo Bellato as another fighter, potentially takedown city, if he can take down, Sterling in that matchup. Those are some of the ones that really stick out to me in terms of takedowns. But, of course, if you got any questions, be sure to line up in the chat. Of course, the main event, which I've kind of already talked about here a little bit here, of Carlos Ulberg and Dom Reyes. Ulberg priced at $9,300, Dom Reyes priced at $6,900. And, it wasn't that long ago that we had written off Dom Reyes. When you think about when he made his return to the octagon in 2024 after nearly being away for 2 years, we did not have a lot of faith in this guy. And when you look at what he's done in these last 3 fights, the win against Dustin Jacoby, win against Anthony Smith, and his most recent win coming against Nikita Krylov, all those fights coming via stoppage in the first or second round. And, this is a guy that, you looked at the peak of his career. You have to go back to 2020 when arguably he beat John Jones in Houston, right before, our whole world changed there. And then everything, it just went downhill. And then he comes back in 2024 and he just, and sometimes taking time off can be a good thing. I mean, a lot of people thought that maybe that chin was shot for him, and he has shown it's not been here. Carlos Ulberg, if you told me this matchup was a year ago, I think Carlos Ulberg, no question, is my fight pick. But I think it's, me and Pete talk about this on the show all the time, is we remember the last thing we saw with fighters, and so you try to not have that thought process with fighters, but you do. And I have that thought process with Carlos Ulberg. He is a guy that I remember that Jan Blachowicz matchup, back in earlier on this year, back in March, and when you look at it and you look at the stats on that fight, he outlands Jan Blachowicz in that one. But to me, it was really just, that first round where he just wasn't active, and that kind of concerns me. And this is a matchup that I primarily think plays out on the feet. I don't necessarily think, more times than not. Probably 8 out of 10 times, I'm going to tell you got to prioritize the main event. I don't know if this week is you have to prioritize. If you sat there and said, hey, I'm playing 50 lineups, that you got to have the main event in 35 of those 50 lineups. It's something where, for me, I will prioritize Dom Reyes. I will get to a limited amount of Carlos Ulberg. And when I talk about getting to a limited amount of him, to me, it's probably, I'm probably going to be under 30% ownership of Carlos Ulberg. I might be 40% or more on Dom Reyes, just because to me the value is so much there when we're talking about a price tag of $6,900. I mean, look, if you're just going to start your lineup with Dom Reyes, starting off with a fighter at $6,900, you're going to be able to get to a lot of the fighters that you want to get to in terms of your DFS lineups. Looking at it from a betting perspective, look, if I was going to take Carlos Ulberg, I kind of like that plus 500 to win via decision, looking at it from the betting side. For Dom Reyes, and I'll be a Dom Reyes backer in this one, I'm just going to play the money line at plus 200. I'm not going to chase the inside the distance or even the win by decision. I would just play at 200. If you want to bet Carlos Ulberg, I think you need to go prop game hunting, or you put him in a if you're looking for like a 3-fighter parlay, maybe you throw him in there. But to me, underdog number one for me is going to be Dom Reyes. I think he gets the job done. I think this fight plays out on the feet. If there is a takedown attempt, I think it comes from the Dom Reyes side of the equation. But I would be relatively surprised if you see a takedown from Carlos Ulberg. If you do see a takedown from Carlos Ulberg, I think the reason you see a takedown will be because Dom Reyes is getting the best on the feet. But for me, the pick is going to be Dom Reyes. The co-main event of Jimmy Crute and Ivan Rslan. Jimmy Crute, the 2-1 betting favorite here, minus 220 when I put my sheet together here earlier today. Rslan plus 180 on the betting line. So when you look at DraftKings, you got 8,900 for Jimmy Crute and 7,300 for Ivan Rslan. And for me, when I think about Jimmy Crute, it's just, we always have these fighters that you're just like, man, do you really trust them? I mean, you look at, it wasn't that long ago that Jimmy Crute, walked away from the sport. Then he's come back, but he's just been up and down. The loss of Hill, draw against Minifield, loss of Minifield, the draw against Bellato, and then coming off that win against Marcin Prachnio in his last matchup where he went out and got the submission in the first round. And he's one of these guys that I just don't have a lot of trust in. Do I think that more times than not he's going to get the victory tomorrow night? Yes, I do. It's tough for me to, look, you're talking about Iván Rslan, and this is where, if you want to talk about a potential surprising takedown city candidate, that takedown city candidate could be Jimmy Crute in this matchup. I mean, just look in his last matchup. Rslan was taken down 3 times by Navajo Sterling. He was taken down in his first UFC matchup by Ian Cutelaba. So you got to imagine that Jimmy Crute could be thinking that. I would say this. I would rather get to an 8,900 Jimmy Crute than get to a 9,100 Navajo Sterling. I'd rather pay 8,900 than getting to a 9,300 Carlos Ulberg, a Jack Jenkins, or a Jake Matthews, just because of looking at what that fantasy score upside could be. Because when you think of Jimmy Crute, I think that fantasy score upside is 100 plus points. And we talk about that every episode. Is we're looking for fighters who can get us 100 points because we know we need 600 points, 620, 650 odd points to take down these big contests. So, I think this is Jimmy Crute's fight to lose. On the betting side of it, if I was going to look at playing anything, maybe I'd probably look at that minus 120 of Crute to win inside the distance. I mean, that the plus 260 of him winning via submission is one. Of course, both of Rslan's fights in the UFC have ended up going the distance there. But, you're not going to feel great about rostering Jimmy Crute just because of his history. But to me, he is the right side to play in this matchup. Then you got Jack Jenkins and Roman Tovares. Tovares, a slight betting underdog here, more than a slight betting underdog. He's plus 240, a minus 300 for Jack Jenkins. Jenkins priced at 9,400 on DraftKings, and Roman Tovares, he is priced at 6,800. When you look at both of these guys, you have very similar statistics when it comes to the stand-up aspect of this game. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think the leg kicks of Jack Jenkins could be really the difference maker in this one. The one thing we have not seen from Roman Tovares in the UFC is that the ability to take the fight to the ground, has not registered a takedown, but has stopped all the takedown offense. Of course, both these guys coming here off a loss. It's a high price tag to play for Jack Jenkins here. I think that, more times than not, this is a fight that's going to go the distance between these two guys. And, the decision props kind of, tell you that, especially on the Jack Jenkins side of him being at plus 150 to take us on the ground. I mean, to me, what scares me about Jack Jenkins, it's not about him going out there and getting the victory. What scares me is, what is that fantasy score upside? I don't know if he has a 100-point upside in this matchup in a 3-round fight, particularly if he just kind of stays on his feet. He plays that range game in terms of that one. So to me, Jack Jenkins is going to be the pick. I just don't know if I really love it from a DFS perspective. Then we got Jake Matthews taking on Neil Magny. Jake Matthews, one of the biggest. He is, let me see here. Let me double check this, make sure I'm right. Yeah, he is the biggest betting favorite on this card, minus 450. I want to say it was maybe even higher. At one point there, taking on Neil Magny, plus 325. Jake Matthews, the highest price fighter on this card. That is 9,600. Neil Magny is at 6,600. Of course, if you remember kind of the timeline of this one, this is a matchup that Jake Matthews has been looking at for a long time. And when you talk about Neil Magny, and I talked about this on my other podcast yesterday, the MMA Report podcast. You can get that link in our Discord channel if you want to check that out of myself and Daniel. We kind of talk about just everything going on in the world of mixed martial arts. We talked about a statement that the TKO COO made about where the UFC goes. We talked a little about PFL. We talked about this trade proposal that Dean Thomas had that if the PFL would take it, they're absolute morons. So if you want to check that out, I really would appreciate if you check that out there. But when you talk about Jake Matthews and Neil Magny, to me, Neil Magny, we'll just call him a capital G, because that's what Neil Magny is. And what I mean by capital G, the G stands for gatekeeper. He is a gatekeeper at 170 pounds. I do like Jake Matthews to win this matchup. One of the concerns that I do potentially have in Jake Matthews is Neil Magny weathering kind of that 7-8 8-minute storm from Jake Matthews. Jake Matthews starts to wear down. Neil Magny comes on in the late second, steals the second round, goes out, wins the third round. All of a sudden, we have a Neil Magny wins by unanimous decision here. Also, here's another thing. I know we're in Western Australia, and you may sit there and say, hey, the Australian fighters, they might have a little edge with judging. We got bad judging everywhere. I don't care where the UFC goes. We got bad judging everywhere. I'm sure we're probably going to have a bad decision on this card. I mean, let's be real about it. That is likely the scenario. By the way, Samuel, appreciate you checking in here in the chat. Also, Andrew, appreciate you checking in as well. This is, and to me, this is very familiar to Jenkins and Tovar. It's like Matthews, because I know one of the popular questions we get here is about leverage plays when we're talking about ownership in DraftKings. And then when you look in that 9,000 range, Jake Matthews right now looking at ownership projections, which, by the way, if you want to get in touch with those ownership projections, there is a link in the description of the show to get those projections over there. For our friends over at 𝗏𝗏, they got a great offer for the Fight HQ listeners. Get 15% off any MMA package. All you got to do is either click that link or use the promo code Fight HQ so that you came to them via the Fight HQ podcast. But Jake Matthews is, like, to me, if I'm rostering him, my entire thought process is it's two things. The first part of it is I'm thinking that Jake Matthews, I'm looking at this as a leverage play. Of where he's at, he's got the least amount of ownership right now in that 9,000 range. Like, that would be my first thought of why I'm potentially rostering Jake Matthews. The other thought is kind of twofold. It is more betting against Neil Magny, that, Neil Magny, as he's aging, guy's been around a long time, that, father time, and clearly he's on the back nine of his career, but you're thinking, okay, we're starting to see the downfall of Neil Magny here, and Jake Matthews takes advantage of that. That could be very well be the potential. I believe I saw the stat with Jake Matthews. I believe he's never been ranked in the top 15 in the UFC, which is absolutely nuts for as long as he's been in the UFC. But the one thing that does concern you about It's Jake and Neil on both sides of the equation is you don't have a lot of volume when we're talking about the striking aspect. Jake Matthews, he lands 3.44 strikes per minute, 3.45 for Neil Magny. So that's a stat that you're not going to love. But, like, from my perspective, and look, I could clearly obviously be super wrong with this, but my thought with Jake Matthews is there's just not enough volume there that makes me go, all right, I'm down to rostering Jake Matthews. The reason I would roster Jake Matthews is a leverage spot, and I'm betting against Neil Magny that the end of Neil Magny is coming. We're starting to see kind of him slow down his career. I'm going to, and then also look, Jake Matthews has wanted this fight for some time, and Neil Magny's thought was, hey man, you want this fight? Come get it. But to me, the pick is going to be Jake Matthews. Then we got a matchup. But I'll say this, when you talk about these first four fights, I mean, the first two fights, I see the fantasy score upside. The last two fights we just talked about, I just don't see the fantasy score upside in terms of that one. Then we got a heavyweight matchup as we got 𝗏𝗏 taking on Justin Tafa. Of course, Justin's brother, Junior Tafa, was supposed to be on this fight card, but he pulled out due to an injury here. And this, to me, is likely your boom-bust play of the week. And I think we could probably say that about any time it's either Junior or Justin Tafa in the UFC octagon, that you feel like it's just going to be a boom bust play. I mean, if you look at Justin Tafa and his time in the UFC, his average fight time is 5 minutes and 27 seconds. Lands 4 strikes per minute. And when you look at 𝗏𝗏 making his UFC debut in this one, he is, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is when I'm looking at people under the price tag of 8,000, he's one of the ones I look at. This is likely low-level MMA, but low-level heavyweight MMA, heavyweight UFC action. You're not going to feel great about rostering this matchup because the likely scenario is if you get this fight wrong, your fighter's only got 3 points, 3, 4, 5 points. I mean, it'll be a very low score at the end of the day. But Sutherland is one of the guys I do want to take a little bit of shot here in terms of that $7,800 price tag. I'll tell you, I could very well see a core roster build for me will be Dom Reyes, Louis Sutherland, and then potentially looking at another one in Jamie Mullarkey at 8,000. That to me could be a very much of a core building process for me as I develop him. And Justin Tafa is just one of those guys. you just know what he is. I mean, now the one thing you have seen, the issue that it really came up in the Carl Williams matchup was that takedown defense. And of course, he's coming off that first round loss early this year in 35 seconds against Tyson Teixeira. I'm going to take the shot here on Louis Sutherland. Don't feel great about it. Let me just say this. As I look up and down this fight card, there's several fights that I don't feel confident one way or the other. But I'm going to take the shot here on Louis Sutherland. I'm also going to take a shot on Charlie Campbell as well as an underdog. Coming here at 7,600, taking on Tom Nolan. This is also another fight to maybe look at from the weigh-in perspective, particularly on the Tom Nolan side of the equation, if there's any issues in terms of this. Of course, this being at 155 pounds. Campbell, mentioned price at 7,600. Tom Nolan price at 8,600. Charlie Campbell, a slight betting underdog here at plus 125. And of course, he's won back-to-back fights. So you look on the other side, Tom Nolan has won 3 fights. And, look, when you look at the teletape, a lot of similarities. The one thing Tom Nolan he is 5 years younger than Charlie Campbell. For some reason, as I've been thinking about this matchup, for some reason, I just see Charlie Campbell winning via third-round TKO. Maybe you take that chance on your whatever your favorite betting sports book is. But for some reason, I just see him catching Tom Nolan in the third round. I think first 2 rounds will be very back and forth type fight. Each guy kind of having their moments, but overall, I think that Charlie Campbell will get the job done on the feet. In terms of this one. Then you got Navajo Sterling and Rodolfo Bellato. Sterling price at 9,100, Bellato price at 7,100. And my concern with this matchup, if you're looking at taking the favorite here in Navajo Sterling at 9,100, is that potential of if he were to get taken down by Bellato in this one. And you really look back to that matchup back at the end of last year against Tuco Tokos, when he was taken down 3 times. Now, he did have 3 takedowns in his last matchup against a fighter that we talked about a little bit earlier in 𝗵𝗁 but to me, I'm looking at Bellato's just not saying that he's a guy that I want to have more than, say, 20% of, maybe not more than 15% of, but he is someone that I would look at if he is able to get this matchup to the ground and he can keep Sterling on the ground. That to me would be there. That's my kind of thought process, that just looking at from a grappling upside, that maybe he can just use his grappling to keep this one to the ground. But I understand if you want to take Sterling in your lineups. But Bellato is a guy that I do want to take a little bit of shots on there. Then you got Cam Rolston taking on Andre Petroski. Rolston price at 7,700. Petroski at 8,500. And I will say this, I'm a little surprised that Rolston's I thought he might be a little more popular. Petroski is one of these guys, and I think we all have these fighters when we talk about, making our DFS lineups, where you've just had good and bad luck with that fighter, and you just don't know whether or not you can trust that fighter in terms of, and to me, Andre Petroski is one of those guys. For Cam Rolston, he's got to keep this fight on the feet. If Petroski is able to make this a grappling matchup, Petroski should win this fight. But what happens if Cam Rolston, even if he gets taken down, is able to get up to his feet? I mean, because the one thing that is his body frame. He's got a long body frame. He's got a 5-inch reach advantage in this matchup. So to me, if you want to be a Cam Rolston backer, the thought process has got to be that he's going to keep this fight on the feet and he's going to stay away from the grappling Petroski. Remember, Petroski averages just over 3 takedowns per 15 minutes of fighting. That's going to clearly be his game plan in this one, is to get the fight to the ground, not make this a striking matchup. Cam Rolston is a guy that I want to take some shots on in terms of DFS, thinking that maybe he stops the takedowns. Petroski really starts to wear down with the gas tank, and he just starts picking them apart on the feet. So Cam Rolston at 7,700 is an underdog that I will be targeting this week. Then you got Jamie Mullarkey and Rolando Bellato. This is your 8,200, 8,000 fight. Mullarkey is at 8,000. Rolando is at 8,200. And to me, I was kind of, in a way, a little surprised by the price tag on this one. And because, call me crazy, but I'm looking at Jamie Mullarkey this week as really a potential solid play, especially if he mixes in the takedowns. Now, we've not seen him be able to successfully do that, since the beginning, since June of 2023, when he got 3 takedowns against Naimov. I mean, that to me, we've seen more of the striking aspect of J.A. Millar. Of course, he's lost back-to-back fights in the first round, but he's a guy that from a takedown city aspect, I have a lot of interest in terms of that. I think Millarkey goes out there and get the job. And from the betting side, I like the Millarkey wins via decision at plus 190 if you want to get away from kind of that minus 115. Then you got 𝗁𝗲𝘁'𝘀 taking on Josiah Musasa. Of course, if you're familiar with 𝗁𝗲𝘁'𝘀, he is a training partner of Alexander Volkanovski. You may remember in his UFC debut, it was really made a big deal about how it was Volkanovski versus Topuria, and of course it did not go his way here. And I know I've seen some sharp minds just that are on 𝗁𝗲𝘁'𝘀 in this one, and he's a guy that I will be targeting in terms of this one. When you talk about Josiah in that one, then you got the women's bantamweight matchup, which I talked about a little earlier. Want to see what it looks like on the scale later on today. You got Montague moving down to 135 pounds after fighting at 145 in the PFL. And then, of course, you got Luana Carolina moving up from flyweight to bantamweight. She had the weigh-in issues. And if this fight does ultimately take place, and we got to see what the weigh-ins look like, I like Michelle Montague in this matchup just because I think she will be able to get this fight to the ground in any way she wants to. That's just kind of my thought process on her. I think that she scores the takedowns. I like her at 9,000 because of that takedown upside, and I think it's probably a second round finish for her, probably a rear naked choke submission. So if you want to go that submission prop, which is plus 185, tells you where the gambling public thinks of it. But Michelle Montague making her UFC debut, she's one that really interests me in terms of this one. You got Brando and Ellison. Brando, an 88 price at 8,800 on this matchup. Of course, this is heavyweight MMA. Both guys making their UFC debuts. Very young fighters. Brando, this is only his 6th professional fight, 7th professional fight for Elisa. Both long heavyweights. 79 inches for Brando, 78 inches for Alicia. So that is something to kind of pay attention to there. I mean, once again, it is always tough to when you have 2 debuting UFC heavyweights because, man, you just don't know what to expect. But everything I've kind of heard about Brando is it looks like that's definitely the side that you want to be on just based on some of the sharp minds I've talked to this week that especially are really in tune to the action outside of the UFC. Then your opening matchup, female matchup, you got Alexia taking on Luma. Luma Lukbumi, even though she's put on a win streak, she's a decision machine. I think she's going to drop her fight here. I like Alexa in this matchup. Do I love the price tag of 9,200? No, I'm not. I'm not big on that price tag of 9,200. Flat out, I'm not big on that price tag of 9,200. And but just kind of go down what my straight up fight picks are going to be. It'll be Dom Reyes, it'll be Jimmy Crute, Jack Jenkins, Jake Matthews, Louis Sutherland. So that's underdog number 2. Then give me underdog number 3 and Charlie Campbell. I'll go Navajo Sterling, but I do see the upside for Bellato in terms of DFS. I'm gonna go Petrosky. But I do have a lot of questions about one. Don't feel great about that one. I do like Jamie Millarkey, who right now is a slight betting favorite. I think 𝗁𝗲𝘁'𝘀 gets the job done. So that's underdog number 4. Then I'll go Michelle Montague, give me Brando in his UFC debut. Then I'll go Alexia to get the win over 𝗁𝗏𝘁. So if you do got any questions, be sure to line those up in chat so we can talk about it. Of course, Sam, I appreciate the super chat, where he goes top leverage plays for each salary tier. So when we look at the 9,000 range, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, to me, the leverage play is Jake Matthews. But when I look at, if I'm looking for someone besides Jake Matthews, to me, it's either Jack Jenkins or Michelle Montague. In that equation, if you said, hey, I got a roster, either Matthews, Jenkins, or Montague, I would go with Montague as the person that I would want to roster just because of the ability for her to take the fight to the ground, rack up the points with takedowns, but also rack up the points in terms of the control time there. But, really Matthews is going to be that leverage play. But my concern with that is just he's not going to get that fantasy score upside that you're going to want to see. Now, when we look in the 8,000 range, and so we've got a lot of fighters who right now are basically 25% and up in terms of projected ownership. There is a lot of total ownership on the matchup of Bedoya and Malarkey. Malarkey, to me, is an interesting one, and I would label him as maybe the best leverage play in this 8,000 range, just because a lot of the ownership is very similar outside Jimmy Crute. Jimmy Crute, I believe he has the highest ownership projection as we currently sit here on a Friday afternoon, just after 2:30 Eastern time. But to me, I look at Malarkey because that takedown upside. I like the ability that if he does incorporate takedowns, that you like the leverage aspect in terms of that one. 𝗃𝗓𝗄𝐶 is another one that it could be a leverage play in this range as well. He's just one of those guys that, I want to see more out of, and particularly at this UFC level. Looking in the 7,000 range, when I look at that under 7,300 and below, 𝗏𝗏𝘁 would be the one that interests me the most if he's able to get the takedowns in terms of that one. But I think the other one, to me, it's either Cam Rolston or Colby Thickness. That, to me, they are the two guys in that salary range that were going to be the leverage plays. I would probably say if I was going to roster either one or the other, I might have more. I'd be more interested in Colby Thickness, but their ownership is very the same. And then when you look in the 6K range, obviously Dom Reyes is going to have the most ownership in that range. Then we look at the other two of Roman Tavares and Neil Magny. Magny would definitely be the leverage spot there. But I'd almost maybe rather go Roman Tavares in terms of that one. Samuel, I do appreciate your super chat. Of course, if you got if you want to help donate to the show, that's always much appreciated. You don't have to do it, but we do appreciate what you do here for Fight HQ. Mention some questions from Discord. First one, value plays underneath 8K and a core 3 on DraftKings. So when I look at a value plays under 8K. So Louis Sutherland, I think, is a value of 7,800, but it's a boom bust play. So I would not necessarily label that as a value play. Cam Rolston at 7,700. If he can keep the fight on the feet, my concern is he just gets grappled, screwed. I mean, he just gets grappled to the ground, can't get up. But if he can keep the fight on the feet, I think he is a value underneath 8K. Charlie Campbell is definitely a guy that I see a lot of value in this 8K range. Colby Thickness, I think, is another one I would throw in there. And then, of course, Dom Reyes, I've mentioned that before. A core 3 for me. So for me, when I had not built my core lineup, so this is just me just kind of shooting off the hip here. I would start off with Dom Reyes. Then I would go Jamie Malarkey. And then I would go Michelle Montague. That would be my core 3. That gives you a fighter in the 9,000 range, a fighter in the 8,000 range, and then, of course, a fighter in the 6,000 range. Next up, Codeman says, Loma or Reyes for cash? Dom Reyes. That's an easy one for me. He's got 5 rounds. If it was 3 rounds, I could see where maybe you have a little debate on, especially if Loma can go out there and get a decision win, even though I don't think that happens. But to me, the fact that Dom Reyes has got 5 rounds to work with, we've seen him go 5 rounds in the past, you got to take Dom Reyes in that situation when you're talking about from a cash game aspect there. Samuel's got his usual questions. Top plays. So for me, my top plays, I would say, when we're talking from a GPP perspective, I think my top 2 plays would be Michelle Montague and Jimmy Crute. And then if I was going to add a third one in that equation, God, call me crazy, Jamie Malarkey. I may be very well wrong with that. Live dogs, man. I think this is a car where the dogs could be a barking. These are just in no particular order. It's just me just going up and down just based on what I've highlighted here. Dom Reyes, Louis Sutherland, Charlie Campbell, Rodolfo 𝗏𝗏𝘁, Cam Rolston, and Colby Thickness. They would be the live dogs for me. Favorite parlays. So if I was going to build a 3-fighter parlay, and let's just say I'm just taking the money line, I would probably, I would go with, to me, I would go Charlie Campbell plus 125. Then I would go Michelle Montague at minus 265. And then my third one, I'd probably put Jimmy Crute at minus 220. That would be for me. Top pump plays. Dom Reyes is a clear number one pump play of the week. Number two pump play, and if we're just saying, hey, going 7,400 and below, I'd probably say 𝗲𝗲𝘁𝘀 being my number two pump play if he's able to utilize that grappling game. That's the key aspect. He's got to be able to utilize that grappling game in terms of that one. Top captain and MVP. I would look Michelle. If Michelle Montague is in the captain contest, she would be one that I would circle because of that takedown upside. But then I'd probably look at someone like a Jimmy Crute. Even though I'm not confident in this one, if Petrosky's able to get those takedowns, he could be a potentially really good play at the captain position. Road to the Manchester Series 6.5, so we're down to 13 fights as we currently do the show here on a Friday afternoon. We haven't had weigh-ins yet, so let's knock on the table here that we're not going to lose any more fights. 6.5. I don't think that's a bad number, Sam. Let me just say that. I don't think that's a bad number. I'll go over, but I don't think that's a bad number. I think you're pretty spot on with what that number should be in terms of that one. Just kind of want to scroll through and make sure I haven't missed any questions in terms of any questions that have come in. I haven't seen any questions, but if you do have a question, you can line those up as I start to wrap up this episode of Fight HQ. Of course, coming up next week, we've got the UFC pay-per-view. What's that? UFC 320? 319? 320? Sometimes I just kind of forget about what they are here as I kind of look it up. By the way, something I did mention on my podcast yesterday is the PFL has an event next Friday. And so I just happened to notice this when I went to the ESPN MMA schedule. That fight is being shown on ESPN Unlimited. So that is not ESPN Plus. My understanding is ESPN Plus will ultimately be rebranded to ESPN Select. So you got to have ESPN Unlimited. So just another streaming platform if you want to be able to watch that PFL show. Of course, that's had by a rematch of Usman Nurmagomedov and Paul Hughes. But next week you got UFC 320, of course, headlined by the rematch between Ankalaev and Alex Bahia. And this is just kind of my very first thought of just looking ahead to this fight card as just looking at the betting odds here. Ankalaev minus 225 and Alex at plus 185. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be on Alex in that one. But, I think a lot of questions. There's this interaction of those two guys in the PI, which kind of makes it very interesting. In terms of that one, Merab and Corey Sandhagen. Man, Merab at minus 400. Get it. Sandhagen may be my value play next week. But we just know what Merab is like there. Yuri and Khalil. That's probably going to be a fight that may be a boom bust type play next week, or should be a fun. Just looking at it from a non-DFS, non-betting perspective. That's a fight that I just look forward to watch. That should be a banger between those two guys. Josh Emmett, Youssef Zalal. That's a good matchup. Wow, Josh Emmett plus 280. Whew. Man, Youssef Zalal minus 370. That's a big price tag to pay on Youssef Zalal. That's because he's going to be in the 9,000 range on DraftKings next week, and for him to pay off that price, he's going to have to be able to stop Josh Emmett in terms of that one. Magomedov, Piper minus 225. Yeah, I get it. We'll see other ones that stick out to me. Shabazian minus 275 against Andre Muniz. Muniz, been up and down. Gutierrez, Bassarat. Patchy Mix on this card, man. I will say this, man, just kind of looking at what that betting odd is on Patchy Mix next week, there may be a lot of people who are off Patchy Mix next week that you may be able to get a little bit of value there in terms of that one. Be interested to see what the Brahima Vanderford line is right on the ESPN website. It doesn't say what that line is going to be. That, to me, is going to be the interesting of what the line is in terms of that one there. Of course, P will be back with me next week as we'll break down UFC 320. We'll keep you up to date in our score channel on when that show could be next week, depending on Pete's schedule of living the dad life and having a newborn and of course my life with everything that goes on with my work. But as always, I appreciate everyone that tunes in for every episode of Fight HQ. Of course, you can check out this show on YouTube. Also, you can check it out on the podcasting platforms, whether you like to listen to podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, wherever you get your podcast, you can get Fight HQ there. Of course, in the link, in the description of the show, you've got the link for Pete's Patreon page as he puts in all of his data for the UFC events. So if you want to help support Pete with his Patreon, that link to that is in the description below. Also, we'll have a DraftKings contest. We'll get that link in the show notes as well. Of course, also have the offer from Stochastic where you can get 15% off any MMA package that they do offer. All you got to do is either click the link or use that promo code FightHQ to take advantage of that offer. So that's going to do it for this episode of Fight HQ, and we will talk to you next week as myself and Pete, we break it down UFC 320.